Hi, ActiveHistory.ca is pleased to present a recording of The Future of the Past, Transmitting History to Future Generations. The session was held as part of the 2014 Pierre Savard Conference at the University of Ottawa. You can find recordings of other talks at ActiveHistory.ca.
Thank you all for coming today. Bienvenue à notre deuxième table ronde de passé dans le futur, comment transmettre l'histoire aux générations futures. The second roundtable, the future of the past, transmitting history to future generations. Today, we've invited historians from the University of Ottawa, a museum in the National Capital Region, as well as from the Federal Public Service. So I will start by asking our four panelists for quick introductions.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Anderson. I am currently on term at the Canadian Museum of History. I'm on loan, as a matter of fact, like a library book from Archives Canada, Library and Archives Canada. I'm an archivist, actually. I have a PhD in history from Carleton, also did my MA there in Russian and East European Studies, and my bachelor's is from McMaster University in Hamilton. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Bonjour, moi Stéphane Lévesque, je suis professeur à l'Université d'Ottawa, à la faculté d'éducation. J'enseigne là l'histoire et la didactique de l'histoire, et je suis aussi le directeur du laboratoire d'histoire virtuelle et récits ici à l'université. Je suis ici, ça fait déjà quelques années. Avant, j'étais professeur à Western, et avant ça, j'étais à UBC, sur la côte ouest. Donc, je vous remercie de l'invitation pour ce superbe atelier. Merci.
Joanne McCutcheon. I'm here at the University of Ottawa now, teaching as a sessional. I've been teaching on and off, I guess, since the 1997, and also finished my PhD here at the University of Ottawa, studying clothing as a source and looking at construction of gender with children, and working on a project that's related to hair now. I also had another life as a entrepreneur and vice president research for a large research firm that was located in Ottawa and Vancouver, and had the opportunity to sort of build research environment that was private sector working with a lot of public sector clients over the years. So I've had experience hiring researchers, building research teams, and then executing the projects in archives and repositories across the country. So that's been sort of an exciting element of the past, and enjoying teaching right now.
Je suis Jean-Pierre Morin, je suis l'historien principal du ministère des Affaires autochtones du développement du Nord du Canada. I've been at INAC, as it used to be called, ANTSI, because everybody's very antsy there, at Aboriginal Affairs since 1999. I actually finished my graduate work here at the University of Ottawa, and then 2 weeks later started at Aboriginal Affairs, Indian Affairs at the time. So there are ways to get an actual government job out of here. As the departmental historian, I work on all kinds of different aspects on the history of the department. I assist with litigation, with claims. I do the actual basic history of the department for those who do not know anything about it. You'd be amazed how many people know nothing. Katie is a former student, and she can attend. She can
she
talk
knows
about
nothing.
No, at how people know nothing. I'm also the lead for the department on the never-ending commemoration file, the Road to 2017 or Canada 150 commemoration file. So we are undertaking all kinds of new commemoration activities. So it's a very wide-ranging kind of job, and it's not what you would normally consider a typical history job, but it's a special kind of place.
So let's get started. Now, we all know the theme of the roundtable today, so I will put it to the audience to see if anybody has a question. Cricket. Okay. So, panelists, first question, and this one is kind of leading off from the roundtable that was basically paneled by students yesterday, and Professor McCutcheon, you can probably talk a little bit and expand upon what was spoken about yesterday as well. How can new technologies help the transmission of history today?
big question to start off with. I think that new technologies like traditional or analog technologies require similar skills development, analysis, work, and you might be able to do a diversity of uses with it, but that we still need to consider the basic foundations of what it is that we are learning with these tools. And so an example that I would use with my students is that you have something like the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, which is a fantastic use of technology in terms of a database that is very usable for students, and that they have exploited database technology, imaging, search engines to make this an excellent use for students. Whereas the House of Commons debates, that's another important tool that people use, has not made use of the technology, that it's really just a series of PDF pages that have been put together in a loose database. And so I think that being able to identify strong technologies, being able to use them well, and then teach students to critically evaluate them and then transmit them in terms of their projects or their possible career choices is sort of one thing that working towards in some of the undergraduate courses.
To add to this, I'm a member of the National Council of Public History, which I encourage you all to participate in and join, which is currently an American-based public history program organization, which is spreading around all kinds of places. And there's a lot of push towards what they have denoted as digital history, which is beyond the simple tools, but how history is taught, how history is used, and how the public engages with history. And this is part of the question, I think, that needs to be part of, in addition to the question, how should history be consumed? I am not an academic. I don't work in academia in any kind of way. I have, this is about as much contact with academia as I get. And the tools and the vehicle of the transmission of the information has to be done in a completely different manner than what we do in an academic setting. There are no such thing as papers in the real world. There are websites, and I know that there's the virtual historian and other tools like that are very useful, but there's podcasts like we're doing here today, there's the Twitterverse and Facebook and whatnot. These are actual tools, not just for transmitting history, but also having the discussion around history. Because if we're just presenting a paper or just presenting content without the discussion, it serves no real purpose. It has to have an actual, whatever we do has to lead to debate about the field.
So I would like to say that it seems to me that this conversation, by the way, that we're having here with about 25, 30 people is part of a larger conversation. Obviously, it's going on elsewhere. You may have seen that last week, Harvard University hosted a similar type workshop talking about the future of the history PhD. The Canadian Museums Association theme this year was the future of museums, and certainly archives have been talking about what the future of their particular profession is, and the centers of archives themselves are. In the States, they're using an acronym called GLAM, so that stands for Galleries, Libraries, Archives, and Museums, where they're talking about not necessarily joining the institutions or even living in the same building, but about the interdisciplinarity between the professions, what they have to contribute, each of them, what they can take away from the discussion. And it seems to me that technology is part of that conversation. So really, my personal hope is that technology can lead to a more engaged public, can help institutions like universities, museums, and other groups engage with civic-minded people, and possibly lead to other kinds of social networking. So we're moving possibly away from simply networking on social media sites towards really engaging with the public, so social engagement. I think that we can see paths to that already. I think we can see emerging initiatives like a few that I know have been discussed already at this conference.
Recently, there was an article, maybe about a year or so ago, on BBC on the website, saying that in the 21st century, we are all, in one way or another, historian in the digital age, in the sense that we often intuitively consume a lot of historical information using technology, whether it's the fact that we're Googling something that we didn't know, whether it's reading material that we get now through push-pull sites of information, but also that we produce, in one way or another, historical material through technology. Think about all the emails that you receive, but you also send and produce. Think about the increasing number of websites now that are recording the experiences of people, whether it's, for example, the September 11 Digital Archive, Katrina Digital Archive, here in Canada, for example, the Memory Project, which is meant to record, preserve, share the stories of Canadian soldiers. We have a number of these activities now that are meant to produce but also share, disseminate information, knowledge about the past through technology. But beyond this, I think what's important to remember is that increasingly, not only do we consume and produce historical information through technology, but that we are shaped by these kinds of technologies. So when we think about a subject, it's not just what we have learned in school or what we get through our classroom textbook. Increasingly is what we get outside of that, through the real curriculum and the experiences that increasingly is being filtered through technology. So we're being shaped by this, and the young generation in particular is highly contagious in the sense that they consume media even more than we personally do in our own lives. But they don't necessarily see it this way. They don't see the filters. They don't see it as a barrier to them. So I think we need to recognize this, that technology is affecting history more than we sometimes think. We like to think that historians work in dusty archival material sources. But more and more historians are working through other means for researching, for producing, but also for shaping people's ideas about the past.
Just to add to that, there's a lot of discussion currently in national archives, not our national, not necessarily just our national archives, but national archives institutions around the world as to the new source as the digital media and the digital content as an actual source. And there were several sessions at the National Council of Public History sessions in California at their annual meeting on how to deal with digital media, digital sources as the same kind of source as we would by going to the archives and pulling open an 18th century journal. How do we deal with those different types of sources, which is a whole category of discussion in and of itself. And for those who are very interested in going to Amsterdam in October, there will be a conference in Amsterdam dealing with digital history, and there's 3 sessions dedicated to this one topic. How do we deal with the digital information and make it into the new source? Because, let's be honest, nobody is writing journals anymore, handwritten journals or blogs, and how do we deal with those kind of absences? So this is all part of this whole tools issue, in my opinion.
Could I add something? Yes. At the CMA last week or 2 weeks ago, discussing the future of museums and so on, somebody mentioned that the tone of some of the conversations could lead an observer to think that there was a certain anxiety in the field. And I just want to mention that it seems to me that we could also, as historians, all of us, historians being a very large term, including archaeologists, anthropologists, and other people who study the past, we could also possibly slide into a kind of anxiety about the overwhelming new technologies, the access to information, the way we can provide those, or the way that gaps still exist in the archival record. I'd just like to point out that it seems to me that historians are gifted with a particular set of skills, and maybe there are a number of skill sets there, to negotiate those kinds of challenges. And in some ways, the skill sets themselves haven't changed over time. So to access a finding aid is essentially the same kind of skill set that you need today to access digital records. And so I would just like to perhaps be a voice of reassurance if ever there was a need of one in a time when potentially we could become anxious about change, in suggesting that historians are, in fact, experts in studying change over time. That's what historians do, after all. And it seems to me that they may be very well equipped to deal with these changes, as difficult as they may be.
Thank you. I'll open it up to the audience if anybody has a burning question. Benoit?
I'd just like to bring it back to the transmission of history itself. And Jean-Pierre, you mentioned Twitter and social media as a mean of transmitting history. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on it. Personally, I don't see how Twitter can be useful to transmit history. And for example, I don't like the idea of a 3-minute thesis, and there's now the equivalent on Twitter, tweet your thesis or something like that. So how can we use social media in that way?
Well, I agree. 140 characters is not something that you can actually transmit in an entire, very profound philosophical thought or historical thought. That being said, there are some people that are remarkably good at it. And I think that it's not just about what you can say on Twitter, it's what you can do with Twitter. It's about taking the Twitter, using the Twitter machine and having it resend to somewhere else. The link that we can put in, the short URL, it's about getting your message out. You have a blog. A blog is to me the new way of getting your information out. It's 1,000 lines, it's 800 words, whatever it is. But if it's sitting on your webpage or in WordPress or in whatever other format that you have, if no one knows it's there, it serves no purpose. It's the same thing as printing an article that appears in a monograph that sits in the library that no one will ever see. Twitter is good at sending out the information, but it's also remarkably good and remarkably bad at having the conversation. You send it out and it leads to the discussion. The discussion used to be done in journals, printed over months. Now it's instantaneous. And you can have that. 140 characters, you can say a lot of very rude things, and you can say a lot of very complimentary things in 140 characters. So that is one of the tools as to how we stimulate the debate with Twitter. I don't think it's about making history with Twitter. It's about the discussion and the debate on Twitter. Just to use Twitter as an example.
I have a colleague who actually he wrote a paper, but actually turned it into a YouTube clip about exactly this very question. Sam Weinberg. The title of you just go on Google and or on YouTube and Google his paper or his video. It's called "Untrained to Tweet." And what he shows is that historians are untrained to tweet. They don't live in that 21st century world. They still, in many ways, live in the world of researching, then producing, then publishing. And then he looks at what is the impact of all of this in the 21st century. And he takes his own case, looking at what he's been doing for the last 20 years in terms of researching, writing, and publishing. Looking at, for example, the impact, publication impact, what he had with all of his publishing in the most difficult, most scholarly, recognized journal in the U.S., with very little return. 38 people citing his work in the field and so on. And he questioned all of this in a world where the impact may not necessarily be just through scholarly publication in the way we do research. If we want to make a change, and I think that's in some way what historians, that we're all trying to do, is to add a little drop in the bucket. We can use technology like Twitter, not because it's the end of it in itself, but because it provides the tools to reach out and have an impact on what we do. So instead of just writing an article that after we're done, it's published, maybe some grad students will read it because it's a required element in a course pack, chances is that most people won't even know about it. There are too many journals, too many articles anyway, and they're shelved everywhere, so we don't necessarily take the time or being aware of all of these. While through technology, we can more easily, first of all, reach out, but also second, find a way, and I like what you're saying, is that technologies or social networks like Twitter's is not about what we write, is what we can do with it. So we can do things and impact people in ways that the scholarly world that we were trained to work in may not necessarily work well, particularly with a younger audience.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, I think like any tool, again, social media, know your audience and what the objectives, and I think that there's great dissemination possibilities with Twitter, but also thinking about it as a conversation and being part of a conversation. And so I couldn't go to the National Council of Public History this year because it was in March and it was a busy time of year, but I could follow the proceedings because people were live tweeting. And so I was part of, the discussion. I could participate from afar. And so when I go to conferences and I live tweet, people who can attend, the Canadian Historical Association can follow different folks with hashtags and be part of it. So I try to introduce, hashtags, social media conversation, and tools not only to my students, but then also to the larger historical community to get more people part of the conversation, because the more people who are involved, the more information gets disseminated. And so, I can, somebody has time to, be searching the web to find the 10 best digital history websites. Well, right now with my teaching schedule, I can't do that. But I see that they've shared that, and that goes into my reading list. And I am benefiting from the dissemination, the conversation, the expertise of literally hundreds of people who are every day researching. And it can be their academic article, and it might be their blog, and it might be their top 10 list. And so then I in turn bring that to my students. So for the first time this year, I had Facebook pages for my students, because after a round, I saw that, every time I pass by, students click, try to really quickly get out of Facebook because they have it open. They have split screens, They're taking notes, they're checking Facebook constantly, or Twitter, And I chose Facebook because I like the graphics. I think I can be more effective. So I made the decision that I could not always prevent them from going on Facebook, no matter how hard I try, It's really difficult. So why don't I try to control the content that they're getting through the feed? So I can belong to the American Historical Association, the American Organization of American Historians, National Council of Public History, historians who have Facebook pages, and then I can share the content of what's going on in history in the U.S. We did the Quebec election, so I could provide them with academic and solid information about the Quebec election to that class, so that I know that they're taking a look at it. It tells me how many people saw it. And then I can get them to get going on a conversation about it, because the likelihood of them reading 5 academic articles on the history of the American Historical Association in a term, less likely than me sending some of the information about this day in history or whatever it might be that I'm getting access to, and then sharing this information. And I think there are ways to improve it, but dissemination, it's more effective than if I post on Blackboard an additional reading, that's 30 to 40 pages, a great article on a deep analysis of a topic, but this generation is multitasking, is doing so many things, and so, if you calculate the amount of time they spend doing stuff, it's more than 24 hours because they're on the bus and doing something. They're walking and doing something. Not always safe and a great idea, but this is reality, right? And so how do you work with that reality? And again, learning to effectively use it. And do I tweet, I'm walking down the stairs and buying a donut? No, right? But I have a community that is engaged and dynamic, and again, I can be part of different conversations. And that's what I want to bring to them. And then I can use it in a teaching way, so that this year I had students write amazing papers where they had to follow a hashtag around Remembrance Day as an example, because there's so much commemoration. So they followed a hashtag a week before, the day of, and a week after, and then they did an analysis of who's tweeting. Is it the public? Are they institutions? Are they presses, university presses? Is it your average World War II vet that's tweeting? Likely not. But then you can follow, are they tweeting articles? Are they tweeting photographs? What kind of information is there? Because all of these tweets are going to be archived, and historians of another generation are going to have to try to sort out this material. And I think we calculated how many pages of information gets published a year through Twitter. It's something like 40,000 pages if you were to do it. And that's a lot of books. How do you go through that information? Well, you need skills to be able to think, okay, what is the party at my place on Friday versus the most important conferences that are taking place this time of year, right? And so you just follow these conversations, and I think it's great.
Thank you.
So I agree with everything that's been said here about conversations and about community. Just to add very briefly to that, apparently there's research to say that institutions that are seen to be community engaged attract funding. So from an institutional point of view, that could be why Twitter is being used. Du point de vue personnel, là, si je peux parler en français, j'espère que ça va. Du point de vue personnel et aussi en voyant les expériences de mes collègues, c'est aussi une question de développement professionnel. Parce que dans le temps où on est un peu, disons, un peu serré avec un budget, peut-être on ne peut pas aller, justement, comme Joe a dit, à toutes les conférences qu'on aimerait aller. Alors, effectivement, avec Twitter, on est stimulé. On peut passer nos expériences, on peut lire les articles d'ailleurs, sans barrière, là, je veux dire, dans des autres pays, dans les autres domaines. Alors là, on est vraiment comme poussé à réfléchir à nos propres tâches différemment, et peut-être, peut-être ça va nous influencer dans notre travail de quotidien. Alors, personnellement, je trouve ça vraiment intéressant, et voilà, ça me change la vie, en fait. Ça m'a changé la vie, Twitter, il faut dire. Surtout si jamais une historienne se sent un peu isolée, disons, pendant le temps qu'il fasse sa thèse, ou parce qu'il habite loin de ses collègues, là, on pourrait vraiment comme passer des liens, peut-être pas de quotidienne, peut-être pas des journaux. Par exemple, on voit beaucoup de ça, là, les gens qui gazouillent les articles récents dans la presse de quotidienne, mais on voit aussi les gens qui font comme des types de Throwback Thursday. Ah oui, un article qui a été publié il y a 20 ans, mais qui parle toujours à nous. Alors, quelque part, je pense que c'est une conversation qui est incontournable aujourd'hui. Vraiment.
Just to add, there's one thing that everyone has to always remember about anything that's on social media and on internet. Once it's out there, it's out there. You think you deleted your tweet, but it's out there somewhere. It's still safe somewhere. And it is one of the things that it's always mindful it's always something to be thinking about when you are doing these kind of things, or when you're participating in the conversation or whatnot. I, for example, if you go on my Twitter feed, you will see remarkably little about what's happening in the Canadian government and the Canadian commemoration scene. You will say nothing, in fact, because that is my job, and I have to be very careful as to what I post and what I tweet professionally, because it is a consideration. It would be a conflict of interest on some levels, and at the same time, there are codes of ethics as a public servant that I have to follow. But it's the same no matter where you are. You always have to take that into account. Because just as you've probably heard the comments about people's postings on Facebook, when you go and apply for a job, we will go and look at your Facebook page. We will. So if it's pictures of drunken parties, it has an impact on what we think about you. It's the same thing with your Twitter account. So a student comes to work for me, I end up following them. Katie doesn't know this yet. So that I know what I want to know. I want to know how the person thinks. So it's part of that thing, and that's just a warning and a consideration that everything. It is a wonderful tool, but it can also lead to your downfall.
I'm actually going to steer the conversation in a little bit of a different direction now, because all of our panelists as well as our audience members have commented on this idea of public engagement and using technologies to transmit to a wider audience and to have a conversation started with a wider audience. However, I am going to poke that tension bubble and ask, is it affecting the quality of content written? Is it affecting the quality of conversation?
I'm going to answer and say no. For the very simple reason that that means there's a conversation outside of the hallowed halls of universities. There's a discussion here in the universities, and then there's the discussion outside of the universities. We just worked on the War of 1812 commemoration. You were probably all very well aware. It was never ending. It's still not done yet, by the way. It'll be done sometime this fall. And when you ask people what the number one book that they've ever read about the War of 1812, they will never tell you it's an academic. They will tell you it's Pierre Burton's War of 1812, 2-volume set, which is so full of historical inaccuracies, it's shameful. But nonetheless, that's what they're reading. Pierre Burton wrote some great public history, popular history. It's not necessarily very good history in an academic sense. And this is the reality. If academics and professionally trained historians are not engaging with the public, the only history that people will get is the popular history. Peter C. Newman writes some great popular history. I don't know how good history it actually is, but that's a different story in and of itself. And it's the same thing from a government perspective. If we don't have that conversation outside of academia, you are literally letting the government decide what you're going to be commemorating and how you're going to be commemorating it and what national message we should be having.
I think it's a question of professionalism, the same as it would be in your everyday conversations, your coffee room chats, your online interactions via podcast. So there's a register that's involved, and somewhere you need to hit the tone and perhaps the content as well, somewhere between super academic to the point of being irrelevant and so colloquial that it could potentially bring down the level of the conversation. So again, I would say that as historians, I think that you probably have the skill set to do that. And if you felt like you needed to be able to tweet that you're going down the stairs to have a donut, you may need to have a separate Twitter account for that kind of conversation.
Unless you're talking about the history of donuts.
I really do think that as historians, the other thing that's interesting here is that if I were running a small business, which I am not, so there's absolutely no conflict of interest involved here. But if I were thinking about what my social media strategy would be, I would want to employ somebody to do that, to think about the strategy and then possibly to actually write the tweets themselves, who was good at risk management. And I would suggest to you that historians have that skill set. So, in other words, you're used to looking at sources, analyzing the sources, weighing them, and making decisions about how valid they are, how much confidence you place in various sources, what the arguments are that would poke holes in your in potentially the discussion that you're making. So I'm thinking that kind of skill set could be also applicable to other domains, including social media, including weighing sources, including possibly future. So thinking about future security risks and so on, which is essentially about perception management, right? So I just suggest to you that historians have those kind of gifts. Potentially, if, a hair salon wanted to have a Twitter feed about fashion and hairstyles and how it's changed over time. Wouldn't it make sense to hire a historian to look into that, to tweet those kind of things? Anyway, that's just to say that I think that it's the opposite is possibly possible. Excuse me. Historians maybe have the opportunity to bring the level of conversation up on social media rather than allowing it to diminish.
Well, it's an interesting question because if we think of public figures like politicians, athletes who might get involved in teaching their sport to children or to young people, we don't necessarily think that the level of hockey that they might play or the level of soccer that they might play is going to be diluted in that way, but that you are opening up to a wider public, the possibilities that career choice has and to get them to aspire. And I think what historians can do is, by being more publicly engaged, and we had a conversation, talking about a lot of the local museums that don't have historians who are involved, that we are not engaged perhaps enough in local history, community history, to share our expertise and to participate in the celebration of commemoration. We think that maybe what's happening isn't the way that we would do it, so by doing nothing, we're having it shaped for us. And so you don't have to dilute it to be active in it. I think that it's a different audience. It's that if I were to give a lecture to a certain group, I want to know my audience, and the kind of information that I would give might be a bit different, but it doesn't have to be less rigorous based on the audience. It still has the rigor, but it just may have different messages and different outcomes that I'm looking for, If I want to inspire a group of high school students to come into the history program, I may share a different kind of research that I'm doing with them. Like last night, the surfing metaphor was great, Aspire, to find that timeless, placeless question is a different way of bringing an idea to your audience, and you wouldn't give that same metaphor to a different group of academics. So I think it doesn't have to be diluted, it just has to know the outcomes and what you're looking to do in that regard.
I'm not sure where I want to go with all of this, but let me put something out and see where it goes, and maybe I can even show things that I have on that. There's a paradox right now in Canada, and it's not just here. It's in many Western countries. The paradox is as follows. There is a belief in the public, often in the media, but particularly among political leaders, conservative in particulars, that people don't know. And they don't do much with regard to history. They don't know what happened, and as a result of this, we need to tell them. We need to commemorate those events so people get a sense of those who came before, what they did, and how great all of this makes us feel in terms of a collective belonging. We see this in Canada, War of 1812 commemoration, First World War, leading on the way to Canada 150, and it started before that. We had a few years before that, 400e de Québec, all of these. And it's not just taking place here, it's taking place around the world. But the paradox is that there is this recurring belief. We don't know. People don't know, and we keep surveying them on quizzes, Canada Day quiz, and we get what we want. They don't know. They don't know who was the first prime minister. They don't know who won the War of 1812. All of these kind of things. And so it tells us that we need to do more of it, so it's the spinning wheel. But at the same time, we do have people, university people, doing research, telling us that people are not so ignorant. Not only are they not ignorant, but they're very active. And the example you talked about is very true in the sense that people do consume a lot of history. There is a book that just came out from a group of colleagues called Canadians and Their Past, a major curious study looking at what it is that Canadians actually do with the past. Canadians are very active. Over 3/4 of them watch historical movies, preserve photographs, attend ceremonies, and so on. They're very active, but not necessarily in the way that governments would like them to be. But more than that, when we look at what it is actually they do know and think, then we get, I think, at the crux of it. Because we spend a lot of times wondering what it is that people don't know. But we don't spend much time, particularly in our research, looking at what it is that they do know. What kind of things do they do know about the past? When you say, well, they do get history through Pierre Berton's or 1812, okay, fair enough. But what is it that they get out of these books? What is it that they get out of schooling? I mean, you guys are all in grad school or undergrad, I'm not sure. But what is it that you will get out of your degree when you get out of it and then try to find a job? Or if I go on the street and ask you, what is the history of Canada, or the history of Quebec, and so on? We don't know much about that. And we need to know more, because that's how people shape their consciousness and ideas about not just the past, about who they are in the present. And that's the kind of things we do. I do with colleagues, or here Jean-Philippe and Raphael. That's the kind of things we work on. What it is that people actually do know and think when we scratch the surface and we look at their consciousness and see what they think and do with the past. And we see that what government thinks or would like us to think might not be exactly what people actually do things and do. There might be divergence, but also sometimes convergence. But the problem is that it's like two separate wolves. They don't seem to navigate in the same direction. So that's the kind of things I'd like people, particularly in the academia, people like you, start thinking. This is that people do know and think about the past when they use it, what I call their usable past. The past that is usable for their life. Not the past was the scholarly book. The past that people use in their daily life.
Questions, Christian?
I feel oddly like a cranky old man with what I'm about to say.
That's okay, I'm already a cranky old man.
Yeah. But it seems to me, and we got to it a little bit in the last question with the following question. It seems to me that the internet is an excellent repository of primary sources. I absolutely adore it for primary sources, because there's so many digital things out there that I can use in my own research. And again, we talked about being enshrined in the ivory tower. And that's where I've chosen, most of us, I believe, in this room, have chosen to be for the near future as students, right? Once we complete our studies, however far we want to go, we've got to make decisions about how we're going to use the skills we've developed, et cetera, et cetera. But nevertheless, when we're in the academic environment, there is such a thing as quality, and there is such a thing as quality of secondary research. And I've had a lot of experiences, negative experiences, finding things on the internet from somebody that I don't know and going, no, that's wrong. Like, I know that that's wrong because I'm an expert in this area. You know, it's Wikipedia, and I got super keen. I could figure out how to edit it, but let's be honest. Does anybody here edit Wikipedia? Oh, really? Cool.
There was a workshop at the NCPH, by the way, about that.
All right, well, that's but within our own areas, what we're trying to do is get at the best truth that we can based on the present. And it seems to me that there's no way to verify the opinions of people on the internet without using the sources that have always been used, the journals, etc. Moreover, those sources are as easily digitally available. So I believe you gave the example of the prof that said, well, my article limit studied 38 times, but how many times has it been read? And moreover, for that specific area, if you've got someone like me, some manner of student, how much has that influenced the thinking overall in the field? And then from there, it can be translated into sort of a more public environment. But to me, it seems that like all of these new digital tools pale in comparison, at least in the academic setting, with the tried and true. So
can I ask a clarifying question?
Please.
To your question? Are you talking about peer review?
Yeah, essentially.
Okay. Because ultimately, the question of peer review is currently being debated until the cows come home when it comes to digital tools, digital media. Everyone is trying to figure out what it is. Because, as was already mentioned and as you brought up again, we don't really know how many people are reading the document, the journal article. It's only cited 38 times. What does that mean? What does that matter? I have one article that has been cited once. In all of the articles I've ever written, one. That's it. And he got it wrong. Okay? He literally transcribed it incorrectly. So how accurate does that make it? Is it about peer review? What does that mean about peer review? Is the peer review process that currently exists in academia something that is translatable to the outside world? Right? This is part of the issue. And we're back again to we're stovepiping it as to what's good for academia and what's good for the rest of the world. And ultimately, I don't think there is an easy answer to it. I think there's a transition. We're moving towards a transition period. In the U.S., they are going rather bananas over trying to figure this one out, because if you think the hiring is low for professors here, it's much worse there because they have 100,000 times more students graduating with PhDs, and there are no more jobs in the U.S. than there are here. So these students who are in their master's, undergraduate, and doctoral programs are doing digital projects. And they want the digital projects to be recognized for when they apply for tenure. But when they apply for tenure, it doesn't count because it's not peer-reviewed in an academic journal. So it's very much a catch-22 on that one aspect. That's the peer review. Actually, your first point, really, which is about this is wrong, this is right. I think we could say the same thing about academic journals. Just because it's peer-reviewed doesn't mean that it's actually all that correct, or that things haven't changed since it's gone up. So I think it's the field hasn't caught up yet to the actual technology and the different mindset that the technology has brought.
Yeah, so actually that speaks to what I was going to ask about. Having just gone through the tenure process myself, and none of that stuff counts at all. I mean, they don't care. Departments do like to see this type of engagement when they're hiring. They love it. They love to see the possibility of it. But the tenure committee at the departmental, the college, and university levels, the second it gets outside your department, they go, "This is great, but where are the publications, the books, and the articles published?" And I wonder in some ways, and this is just a positive question, because I'm not a historian of public memory. I'm a historian of 18th century French North America, and that's what I focus on. Now, I read some stuff on public memory because it's really useful, but I can't spend my whole day there. I can't spend my whole day on public memory because I have to spend my time on my 18th century sources. Otherwise, I can't do my work properly. And so there's a sort of fracturing of your attention span, a sort of some people call it multidisciplinarity, some people call it multitasking. Of course, there have been a lot of studies on multitasking that show just how ineffective a lot of multitasking is. And so then it comes down to the question of, is this really something that all historians should really be engaging in a major way, or is it kind of like there's sort of a long-standing public history debate where some historians do really good public history, but it's not something we can expect of all historians. Maybe at an institutional level, in departments and colleges, there should be the types of support structures to send this out. We talked about if you were a business, you'd hire somebody to do these things. Why does it fall to the historian to all of a sudden become the public relations person to disseminate the information outside of what they've been really trained to do, which is work within that academic sphere?
No, go ahead.
Wow, that's a great question. It's a really interesting question. I think ultimately, for me personally, it comes back to the idea of the big tent approach to history. The big tent approach to what it means to be a historian, an archivist, a museum curator, and so on. Nobody needs to do all of that. Nobody needs to be a specialist. To say that you don't have to categorize yourself or perhaps self-identify as a type of historian that does only public history or only 18th century France. But if you choose to do so, then obviously there's a place for that as well. And what I'm thinking is that perhaps, it's connected to one of the questions that we were given here. How can history compete? How can history compete with mainstream media, film, newspapers, web, and so on? Why does it need to compete? Why isn't there simply a space for all of these avenues, all of these, let's say, manifestations of history? And perhaps we could just accept that there is a type of historian who feels very strongly that a peer-reviewed prestige journal is the only path to promotion. And then there will be other historians who feel that if you work at a publicly funded institution, then your research inevitably belongs to the public and should be accessible to the public in the most digestible manner available, which may today be Twitter and may tomorrow be something else. So I'm just thinking that really there's no, from my point of view at least, there's no competition between all of these types of history. And ultimately, it may be that your research in 18th century France later is read, understood, discussed in a museum and becomes part of an exhibition. In fact, you may be involved in consulting on that exhibition. And all the power to you, right? It seems to me that those kind of partnerships, like the kind that we heard earlier that are happening between universities, institutions of public history and so on, are really the way of the future. Because we can't be everything to everyone. Let's share what we have. Let's somehow pile all of our skills together and see what comes of that. My personal opinion.
Can I just really quickly add to that? Ultimately, we need all kinds of historians, right? I am very much active in the public history world, but I actually don't like the term public history. I'm a historian, period. When I'm with my public history folk, I'm a public historian. And when I'm with the general public, I just say I'm a historian, because you start saying public historian, they don't actually know what that means. But ultimately, the public historian and the academic historian, to use those categories, both have to exist, because one needs the other, in my opinion. If there weren't people in the university, in the academic field, doing the research, when I come as a public historian to come and use some of this material, if it's not there, that means I have to do it, first off. And secondly, as a public servant, I don't have the opportunity or the availability to be able to go and do that. I can't go and spend 5 years researching the fur trade. I can't. I don't have the time, because it's not what I'm mandated to do by the department. So to me, there shouldn't be an actual debate. You want to be an academic historian? Be an academic historian. I fully encourage you, and please let's share our research. But at the same time, the issue of universities not recognizing the different media as part of tenure, well, that's a completely different debate. And I think it's one that's it's not just unique to history. I think it's across the board in all fields, from what I can tell.
This is great. I sit on the promotion tenure committee, and it's exactly the kind of questions that needs to be brought up with graduate students, but also new professors. What are we expecting junior professors to do when they are hired, but also when they progress so that they get promotion and tenure? And I don't think there is, as you said, one simple answer or solution that fits for everyone. But there is certainly something which is becoming clearer and clearer in the picture, is that whatever you do, whether you work as a 18th or 19th century French, American historians, whether you do like me, digital history, or work with student teachers, there is one thing that we're all increasingly expected to do. It's knowledge mobilization and transfer. We all have to do that. It's the big buzzwords of SHIRT. I was talking with Chad Gaffield about that recently. You will not get funding if you don't show the relevance of your work in having some kind of impact down the road. The impact could be in your own field, scholarly field, but it can be broader than that. And the example you talked about designing museum exhibits, about being consulted. I was consulted, for example, for the creation of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, because they wanted people to investigate that. Historians can be, used for so many different kinds of things. You say, well, working on 18th or 19th century history, what does this have to do with today, the present? Well, here's an example. A textbook came out recently in the U.S., dealing in particular in a section of the textbook about the Civil War. And there was a passage in there where the author of the textbook talked about the fact that the Confederate Army enrolled blacks into their army, and even created 2 black regiments that would fight for the Confederates. And when it came out public and so on, and she was questioned about that, well, she said that she had found the information on the internet. And then she thought it was good enough for the textbook. Well, here's a good way for historians to get into the debate and say, well, wait a minute here. There are other ways of doing history. So the kinds of work you do may initially have impact in your own field of study where you do research and publication. But it has also resonance outside of that in so many different kinds of ways. So it's how you decide to mobilize that knowledge. And obviously, writing newspaper article will not get you tenure or any kind of things like that. You need to have those scholarly peer-reviewed support. You need to bring in some money through research grant agencies and so on. These are ranked very highly, and for some good reasons as well. But increasingly, we're expecting more professors. Why? Because the public is also expecting more of us. Because they don't know what's happening in those so-called ivory towers. They don't know what's happening here. So that was the main argument of Jack Gaffield when he came into power. He says, instead of complaining that the public doesn't know what we're doing, we need to show the relevance of what we do. And I think that's more and more what we're expecting junior professors, is show the relevance of what you do and the impact of what you do have on society.
So we're coming down to the last 20 minutes. I'd like to steer some conversation towards teaching again. And questions. I have these questions because we are talking a lot about Twitter and social media, and everybody being able to access information and being able to self-educate, etc. So perhaps I could start with a question with you. Where do you see the idea of the exhibit or the exhibition going if somebody can just walk into a museum and tweet or post a picture of the exhibit or comment on the tour on Facebook or on Twitter or on Instagram?
Wow, okay, so it's a great question. I think that probably in one word, the answer is visitor-centered. So along the lines of recent pedagogical research that has suggested that student-centered classrooms facilitate all kinds of learning styles, I think that what we're looking at in the museum currently is a visitor-centered exhibition, where in fact a visitor tweeting or responding in some way, in any way, ultimately even in a negative way to the exhibit, is an interaction that the museum will eventually welcome because it shows engagement, it shows potentially where improvements can be made and where possibly more knowledge can be sought. So that's in terms of social media. I think some museums already have been working on visitor-curated exhibitions where it's been, for example, crowdsourced, where the artifacts themselves are crowdsourced from a community. I'm thinking especially about smaller local museums who may not have the depth of a collection. So they can actually reach out to their community and say, look, we'd like to present an exhibition on this subject. What do you have in your basement, attic, and so on that would contribute to this? And so people are engaged with that. Surprisingly, people seem to engage more with an institution when they can actually see their own personal story. Maybe that's not so surprising. When they see their own personal story reflected in the exhibition. So crowdsourcing is probably one avenue towards that. Maybe also revealing a little bit more of how a museum exhibit comes to be. In other words, involving the public at earlier stages when the conception is still underway, possibly talking about what kind of subjects people would like to see in a museum, and ultimately having them make suggestions about the theme, about the inclusion, about the artifacts and the ideas that are presented there. There you go. And in terms of education itself, it seems to me that asking students to look at an exhibit or potentially suggest an exhibit, maybe even develop one, is itself a really interesting avenue towards public engagement. And that might take the form of digital history. Ultimately, it may be a digital, it may be an online exhibition. It may involve bringing together artifacts from different museums, as museums already do, right? They are very involved in borrowing and loaning objects to each other. But what if that were to happen in a virtual sense? What if that were to say, one example that I've been thinking about and it's been tossed around a little bit on the web is the idea, let's say if we were talking about the rebellions of 1837, if we were talking about Upper Canada in particular, all these prisoner boxes that were made at the time, a good number of them are kept by the City of Toronto museums, but there are others elsewhere. The Royal Ontario Museum has some, the Canadian Museum of History has some. What if all of those virtual images of prisoner boxes were brought together and we could actually analyze, see possibly all angles of each of those prisoner boxes, think about who made them, for what reasons, for whom, because often they were gifts. And then, with 3D printers, maybe classrooms could print a prisoner box and think of, anyway, this is just one example, but I think that there are all sorts of avenues for museums to engage more fully via technology with each other and with the public.
Do any other panelists want to add?
Go ahead. These are just my thoughts, by the way. This is what other people are suggesting. So I'm just sharing with you what I've heard from other people, and archives are thinking about that too, because as Jean-Pierre said about academic historians and public historians, I think that archivists and museum curators really need each other as well. And so when we talk about artifacts, we're not talking only about 3D artifacts anymore, especially if we're talking about virtual exhibitions where documents can be much more accessible, where there's no conservation concerns about paper and so on. So archives are really part of that conversation.
Une question pour nos profs sur la table ronde. Where do you see the university institution going with all of this availability of information online, on the TV? And specifically, where do you see the university going now that we can easily upload lectures, videos of lectures, recordings of lectures? Do you see teaching going in the direction of being distance teaching? Do you see the role of the classroom lecture being stable for much longer?
I think if there was a simple answer to that, we would just not be here. It would have been provided and we would just go with it. there is an institute in the U.S. doing every year a survey across North America about the students' experience on campus. It's called ECAR, E-C-A-R, ECAR. And they do a study every year surveying undergrad students across North America, asking them about their experience. And some of the questions include their experience in the classroom, but also their use of technology. And what's interesting is that there is an assumption, particularly among the professors, still very prevalent, is that the more we put online, the less student will get in class. Because they'll just go, as you say, online, get it, and then do their work. And what the evidence is showing, it's not true. Actually, the more professors put online, the more students are engaged. And the more are likely to come to your class. And so it's very counterintuitive. So we like to think that if we're going to put our lectures and materials on the web, or like if you're here at the university, you're using Blackboard, well, why would they come to class? You know, they can just pick the material, do the readings. No, the reality is that students want to have that engagement with the professors, with the community that they're part of. And I think it's a matter of balance. To a certain point, they want more and more, but at a certain point, they get saturated. They don't want more online. What they want is to have still the conversation, the discussion, the questions, and the answers from the professor. So the evidence are showing that it's not true, that technology actually is taking students away from a learning experience with the community. And I've tried it myself. I don't know if the other ones have done it. The more I'm using technology with my students, surprisingly, they're more engaged. It doesn't necessarily do that they do the reading any better. But at least they don't have any reason to tell me they don't have the reading. It's right there. They can do it anywhere they want. They have it. But within the context of the classroom, I think often we don't necessarily use it as much as we could. We use it as a way to send out the information. So it's posted on the Blackboard. It's available online. But beyond this, I think the challenge is how we can make use of it within the context of the classroom in which we work with the students.
So if I were to think of this this past year, I would say that I would agree with my experience anecdotally, supporting this research, in that I had much better classroom attendance, even though lectures were online, Facebook group, all those things. Students were incredibly chatty and social in some of the classes in particular. And when they couldn't come to class, a class of 80, 90 students, and I've got students coming to say, sorry, I couldn't make your class. And I'm like happens, but they want to let you know that they're not there. And there was a question about the conventional lecture being over in this idea. And I think that we need to have some element of providing information, but that there might be an important way in which we can integrate these technologies, film, documentaries, small group learning, and that getting to know the students and what they're looking for is helpful. So try to start that from the beginning of the term. Who are you? Where do you come from? What do you want from this class? What is it that you're interested in? And then adapting and just working with the students in that way. And technology can facilitate that, but doesn't have to replace, right? There are some people, I do have one student who has submitted everything online, and I've yet to meet them. And that's 1 out of 130 students. I don't know what I could have done differently to get that student out of their house. I keep asking to meet them, but it'll be the grade that they get that probably wakes them up. But other than that, right, you will have students that have busy lives, or something's going on that they aren't engaged. But even the ones who don't necessarily get their work done, they're still engaged, and they're like, I'm really sorry that I'm not engaged. I think students fundamentally want to learn, want to get the tools to learn, and want to be better researchers, writers. And that's the two things that they often say. I want to learn how to research and I want to learn how to write. And I think the context information of dates and people, is a way in which they learn that. But that's, there's certain elements of history that really interest them. But at the end, they want to be, better participants in the literate society that we have. And we can do lots with technology to support that.
Could it be that technology also allows more people to participate, people that may not traditionally participate in a tête-à-tête, let's say, people who may have other challenges that teachers and historians generally are not aware of? I don't know, I'm thinking about mobility challenges, I'm thinking about maybe class, gender issues that might bring in, I don't know, child care, last minute elder care issues and so on. I'm just wondering if by interacting with students online, you might be offering other avenues so that people of all backgrounds and all life situations, regardless of age, regardless perhaps of personality, maybe some timid people may be more forthcoming online than they would be in person, feel free to ask questions that they might hesitate otherwise to do. But I'm just thinking that, in fact, we may be moving towards a more inclusive discipline of history.
So what everyone is saying is that there are still a possibility for jobs for our PhD candidates in the room today.
I honestly think that we have to think outside the box for that. Like the idea that you go to grad school and then you put out your CV and then you get a job for the federal government, or you end up in a museum, or you end up in a professor, is like the kind of the dominant way we think about it. But I think there's so many now different ways of thinking about what you guys do or can bring to the professions. Historians are useful in so many different kinds of ways that we don't necessarily think initially. Many of my students come from a history department, they come to education, they get their degree, but the market is saturated. Most of them will not necessarily get a job, certainly not a full-time job initially. But people have to reconfigure themselves, do different kinds of things. I have now students who come to me, and when they're done, well, they end up working as museum educators because they need people to educate through the museums, and they don't need just the historians. They need people with also educational backgrounds and degrees. There's so many other different, I think, venues than just the typical streamlining.
And I think ultimately, the history field, the education in history, from the BA all the way up to the doctorate, is something that allows very specific and very unique skill sets that are only found, in my personal opinion, as an historian and as a civil servant, that changes how people interact. For those who aren't aware, it's roughly 1/4 to 1/3, depending on how you want to count, of all civil servants that have a history degree. That's 100,000 civil servants, roughly, that have a history degree of one level or another. The number of assistant deputy ministers and deputy ministers with history degrees is 40% have history degrees. So there's a certain skill set that actually being able to do research, to do the analysis, and by the way, it's the analysis part. There's a special skill to being able to do historical analysis, and that is so transferable, it isn't even funny. I know that I can pull a history student and say, can you please do this? And 9 times out of 10, the history student who works for me knows exactly what to do. They know how to do the research, how to come up with a plan to attack it, and how to actually produce something that can actually be useful for me. Katie is sitting right here. I'm going to point her out. She hates it when I do it. I'm going to do it anyways. Has done this on several occasions when she worked for me last summer. It is very, very good skill. And that ultimately is one of the things about what everyone needs to think about when you're in the field. Because there are very few jobs as academics, as professors. There aren't many. If you're on the H Canada listserv, you'll know that there's maybe one a year, maybe two if you're lucky, and then there's a variety of other things. But when you go into the different fields, into the different job environments, it's about flexibility, adaptability, and the ability that history students, I find, have to be able to take the information that's being presented to them, digest it, and literally spit it back out in a manner that is understandable to people. You can tell who's a political science student, who was a political science student in the federal government, and who's a history student. Because the political science student will arrive with grandiose theories that make absolutely no sense, while the history student will arrive with an actual concrete set of this happened, and then this is what we should probably do with it. I speak from experience. This is it's very evident in the government as to who has what kind of degree.
We have time for one or two small comments from our panelists. So you want to go?
I was going to say that we should not underestimate the power of reverse mentoring as well. So as much as social media may be used to disseminate information, to gather information, to search, and so on, I think that there's also an element of reverse mentoring that's going on there. So by following a student, by following professors and people elsewhere, I personally am learning every day. And so that's just to say that knowledge is valued. And when it comes to placements, internships, co-ops, and so on, that is why you are being hired. It's not just because you have a skill set that you're going to do something for the institution. It's because you are potentially motivating the people who work there. So I encourage you to keep doing it.
And just as a follow-up, agree that the skill set, I certainly, while considered other disciplines that people had their training in to hire, but consistently went to students with the training in history at, MA, PhD, and undergraduate level as the ones who are able to do the work that was required, and certainly think that this is important skills. I think it's in the United States, the American Historical Association just received a large grant to actually study, alternative careers for PhDs, thinking outside that box of, you have to go into academia at different levels, and there have been sessions, talking about transferable skills and again, social entrepreneurism, education, filmmaking. There's just so many ways in which you can contribute, and writing well. I mean, when you write well, you communicate well. There are a lot of firms and private businesses that can make use of your skills that, they don't know what this Twitter thing is, and they need somebody who has, these skills to be able to support them. And consistently in organizations I'm involved with, they'll talk about, students who have the skills described by Jean-Pierre, as well as social media skills or diverse technology skills, that they're the ones that they're looking to.
Thank you very much. And just as a side note, Professor McCutcheon, I know you've been tweeting about Pierre Savard.
I tried. There was no hashtag.
Why didn't you just create the hashtag Pierre Savard?
I did, but there was no official hashtag.
Well, now that should be your hashtag for the future.
Next year. Well, that brings this wonderful roundtable discussion to a close. Thank you to
You've been listening to a recording of The Future of the Past, Transmitting History to Future Generations. The session was held as part of the 2014 Pierre Savard Conference at the University of Ottawa. You can find recordings of other talks at ActiveHistory.ca.